U.S. President Joe Biden hosted his South Korean counterpart Yoon Suk-yeol and Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida at Camp David on Friday. The three leaders are hailing the summit and calling it a milestone. In the next few minutes, let's tell you why this summit is important and what it aims to achieve. This is a first-of-a-kind trilateral summit at the presidential retreat in Camp David. There is the first formal meeting between the three nations, though the leaders have met earlier, but only on the sidelines of other meetings. This is their first standalone meeting in Camp David in the United States. The meeting comes amid high geopolitical tensions. All the nations share same concerns, especially on threats from North Korea and China. These threats have prompted an increased cooperation between the three leaders, which they have hailed and termed as a new era in their ties. Leaders have agreed to make the summit an annual affair going forward. A key aspect of this summit is that it brings together Japan and South Korea. The two nations have had frosty ties or even relations historically due to unresolved disputes stemming from Japan's colonial occupation of Korea. But the current situation in the region has prompted a thaw in their ties. What we also know now is that during the summit, the leaders fell short of announcing any formal alliance. However, they agreed to expanding their security and economic cooperation. The leaders also agreed to hold military training exercises every year. The trio has also agreed to boost communication mechanisms in their three countries. A three-way hotline will be set up between the three nations for times of crises in the three countries, and also in the Indo-Pacific, and in the three countries, like I mentioned, that is South Korea and Japan. The three nations will also jointly develop an early warning system pilot to identify potential supply chain disruptions and counter economic coercion. Now, though President Biden said that the summit is not about China, the leaders issued their strongest joint condemnation to Beijing. In the joint statement, they called out China's dangerous and aggressive behavior. The statement also mentioned that there will be a strong opposition by the leaders of unilateral attempts to change status quo in the Indo-Pacific region. Meanwhile, they also called out North Korea explicitly in their statement. Leaders agreed to improve joint responsibility on North Korean nuclear threats. They reaffirmed their commitment to the complete denuclearization of North Korea and urged the country to abandon its nuclear and ballistic missile programs. And they also agreed to share real-time information on North Korean missile launches. The summit is likely to bring reactions from China and North Korea. China is closely monitoring the development and is said to be on high alert. Chinese envoy to South Korea has said that the country firmly opposes any act targeting it. This is the first statement from North Korea and also China. China had earlier warned that the summit could increase tensions and confrontation in that region, the Indo-Pacific region. Meanwhile, South Korean intelligence had also alerted that North Korea could also ramp up its missile tests that can coincide with the summit, or it could be in defiance of the upcoming second round of U.S.-South Korea large-scale military drills. So this is what happened in Camp David, just to bring you up to date with the events that unfolded when these three leaders, President Joe Biden, Yoon Suk-yeol and Fumio Kishida, met in Camp David. We have our correspondent Susan Teherani, who has sent us a report from New York.
During that press conference, President Biden said that there wasn't much he agreed with his predecessor Donald Trump when it came to foreign policy. While that may be true in some areas, notably reinforcing America's alliances abroad or giving local support to democracies around the world, on issues regarding trade with China or reestablishing ties with Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, the Biden administration has more or less taken the same path as the Trump administration. What was interesting regarding China was that during that 30-some minute press conference, none of the leaders mentioned China even once until reporters reporters started asking questions. Republicans across the aisle had hoped that President Biden would have taken this opportunity at this summit to be more frank and take a more stronger approach when it came to China, notably what America and its allies would do should China attack Taiwan. Susan Tehrani reporting from New York for WION World is One.
Let's also continue talking about this summit, one-day Trilateral Summit that happened in the United States. And joining us now is Dr. Robert Edwin Kelly. Dr. Kelly is an American political analyst on inter-Korean affairs and also a professor of political science at the Pusan National University in Busan. Dr. Kelly is joining us on this program. I'll just start by asking you, Dr. Kelly, thank you, first of all, for joining us on WION World is One, and it's good to see you.
Thank you for having me.
Now, this meeting is both unprecedented. It was also unthinkable, where you have United States meeting with South Korea and also Japan at the same table. All credit goes to US President Joe Biden. What do you make of this summit going forward? What do you think is the major takeaway from this summit?
Sure. I think the most important, thank you for having me. I think the most important takeaway is the fact that the U.S. was able to convene South Korea and Japan together at the summit level in one place, right? And the very fact that the summit is happening is actually probably the most amazing takeaway. Just a few years ago, South Korea-Japan relations were really, really poor. You covered some of the reasoning in the lead up, sort of the colonial period and things like that. There's sort of a lot, disputes. Their relations have been pretty frosty. And so for a long time, everyone was really pessimistic that the U.S. would be able to get South Korea and Japan to work together on issues that all three countries share, most obviously North Korea's nuclear program, and then, of course, the rise of China. So the fact that it happened is pretty amazing. I think that in itself is the big story here, right? But it's also the reason why there haven't been too many concrete takeaways, right? There hasn't been sort of like any real discussion about like what would the three countries do if North Korea used a nuclear weapon, right? We have to start thinking about these things, and the relationship between the three just isn't mature enough to discuss that. So we got the hotline, and you get some vague commentary about whether there's going to be more strategic consultation, and that's great. It's better than nothing. But what's really lacking here is sort of like any kind of like details about what that would be, and that's probably just because it's amazing that this thing even happened at all.
Dr. Kelly, the three leaders agreed on enhanced information sharing and also coordination. A statement from the White House reads, and I'll actually read the statement to you: the United States, Japan, and the South Korea are committed to further strengthening trilateral security cooperation, including through enhanced trilateral defense exercises, improved information sharing, and increased cooperation in ballistic missile launches and defenses, including against the North Korea. How do you see this going forward?
Right. So the big issue there of that in that statement, right? So intelligence sharing has been around for a while, right? The South Koreans and the U.S. and the Japanese have shared intelligence in the past, sometimes directly, sometimes South Korea and the U.S. have, South Korea and Japan have shared information through the United States as a middleman. But missile defense, right, where the three actually cooperate on missile defense, that I think is the big insight in that statement. It would be really great if South Korea, Japan, and the United States had a shared missile defense net in Northeast Asia. This is something we know the Chinese really oppose, but if you think about the fact that North Korea routinely launches missiles and North Koreans routinely make missile threats and are putting nuclear weapons on top of their missiles, right? There's actually a pretty strong security argument, strategic argument for the three to cooperate on missile defense. And that, again, when it comes to the question of sort of takeaways, that's probably the closest there is to a real takeaway. If we actually get integrated missile defense in Northeast Asia, that would be a pretty big step. But I would argue that that's actually still several years away too. That's a good statement, but it's aspirational.
All right, Dr. Kelly is an American political analyst on inter-Korean affairs and also a professor of political science at the Pusan National University in Busan. Dr. Kelly, thank you all very much for your information and for talking to WION World is One today.
Thank you for having me.
WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.